Welcome to Law Enforcement Encounters, Learning the Badge. Lesson 1, Police Contacts, Understanding the 4 Types of Police Encounters. Introduction. Hello everyone and welcome to Law Enforcement Encounters, Learning the Badge, the educational series of Law Enforcement Encounters. My name is Samuel Davis Jr. I served 28 years with the Sacramento Police Department, including 17 years on patrol. I retired in 2018. Today, I teach criminal justice in a criminal justice academy because I truly believe that education has the power to save lives. The purpose of this series is simple: to educate citizens, to educate future police officers, to educate current police officers, and to build understanding between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Now, before we begin today's lesson, I want you to think about something. If a police officer walked up to you right now, would you know whether you were free to leave? Most people don't. Some think every conversation with the police officer is an arrest. Others think they can simply walk away whenever they choose. Neither one is always true. We're going to talk about the 4 types of police contacts because understanding them can make one of the most stressful moments of your life a whole lot less confusing. It may even save your life. Let's get started. Chapter 1, Understanding Police Contacts. One of the biggest misunderstandings in America is that people believe every police contact is the same. It's not. Every contact between a citizen and a police officer generally falls into one of 4 categories. If you remember these 4 contacts, you'll have a much better understanding of what is happening during almost every encounter with law enforcement. Let's go through them. The first is a consensual encounter. The second is an investigative detention. The third is a vehicle stop. And the fourth is an arrest. Now here's what I want you to pay attention to. The question you should always ask yourself isn't, why is this officer talking to me? The better question is, am I free to leave? Am I free to leave? Think about that. That one question will usually tell you exactly what type of police contact you're having. Let's look at each one individually. Chapter 2, the consensual encounter. A consensual encounter is exactly what it sounds like. It's a conversation. Nothing more, nothing less. The officer walks up, says hello, maybe asks you a question, and begins talking with you. At this point, you are generally free to leave because you are not being detained. Now, let me give you a real example from my own career. Many times my partners and I would stop at an AM/PM gas station to grab a cup of coffee, use the restroom, or just take a break between calls. As we stood outside, people would pull up into the gas station to buy gas. Now, something interesting would happen. Every once in a while, someone would notice the police car. You could almost see it on their face. Some people looked nervous, some avoided eye contact, some watched us a little too closely. As police officers, we notice behavior. That's part of our job. So every once in a while, I'd simply walk over and start a conversation. I'd say, hey, how you doing today? Maybe we'd talk for a few seconds, then I'd ask, do you have a driver's license? Now, here's what most people don't realize. That person did not have to answer my question. Why? Because this was a consensual encounter. They weren't being detained. They weren't under arrest. It was simply a conversation. Now, here's the interesting part. Most people answered it anyway. And believe it or not, more than once I heard, no, I don't have a driver's license. They volunteered that information. I didn't force them. I didn't threaten them. I simply asked a question. Now, I want our young people to understand something very important. Just because a police officer asks you a question doesn't automatically mean you are legally required to answer it. If you're involved in a consensual encounter, you should understand the difference. That doesn't mean you become rude. It doesn't mean you become disrespectful. It doesn't mean you start arguing. You can simply be polite. You can ask, officer, am I free to leave? If the officer says yes, then you've learned something important. You were having a consensual encounter. Knowledge matters. Understanding the law matters. Because when you understand what's happening, you're much less likely to become confused or frightened or make a bad decision. Chapter 3, Investigative Detention. Now let's move into a second type of police contact, the investigative detention. This is where many people become confused. During the consensual encounter, you're generally free to leave. But once an officer tells you that you're being detained, everything changes. You are no longer free to leave. Now let me explain why. An investigative detention occurs when a police officer has a legal reason to temporarily stop someone while investigating possible criminal activity. Notice in the word I use, investigating. At this point, the officer isn't saying you're guilty. The officer isn't saying that you're under arrest. The officer is saying, I have enough information to temporarily stop you while I determine what's really going on. And that's an important distinction. One of the biggest mistakes citizens make is believing that being detained means they've already been judged. That's simply not true. A detention is exactly what it sounds like, a temporary stop while the officer gathers facts. Now let me give you a real example from my own career. The apartment complex. I was working in South Sacramento when dispatch sent out a suspicious person call at an apartment complex. Several neighbors had called the police. Now here's something I want you to remember. It wasn't just one caller. It was multiple callers. Each one described basically the same thing. They said there was a young man wearing a tan shirt, blue pants, blue Nike tennis shoes. He was walking back and forth through the apartment complex. Not just standing there, pacing. Every few minutes, a car would pull up to the parking lot. It didn't matter who was inside. One person, two people, sometimes 4 or 5. The young man would immediately walk over to the vehicle. He'd reach inside, shake the hands of the driver, exchange just a few words. The entire contact lasted maybe 5, 10 seconds maybe. Sometimes a little bit longer, 15, 20 seconds. Then the vehicle would drive away. The young man would turn around, walk approximately 180 feet back to the same location, stand there or sit there, watch for another vehicle, and then repeat the exact same behavior. Again and again and again. The neighbors watched this happen over and over. Eventually they became concerned, so they called the police. Now, let's stop the story for just a second. Did the neighbors know a crime was taking place? No. Did I know a crime was taking place? No. But here's what we did have. Specific observations, repeated behavior, multiple independent witnesses describing the exact same activity. And that's important because police officers don't investigate rumors. We investigate facts. The information I received gave me a reason to go find out what was actually happening. And that's what police work is, investigation. The contact. When I arrived at the apartment complex, I immediately saw a young man. Tan shirt, blue pants, blue Nike tennis shoes. He matched the description perfectly. I walked over and contacted him. I identified myself as a police officer. Then I told him something very important. At this time, you're being detained while I investigate a call that was reported to the police department. Notice what I did not say. I didn't tell him he was under arrest because he wasn't. I didn't accuse him of selling drugs because I didn't know that. I told him exactly what happened. He was being detained, and while he was being detained, he was not free to leave. That point is extremely important. Once an officer lawfully detains you, you don't get to decide when the detention ends. The officer does. Not because the officer wants to control you, but because the investigation hasn't been completed yet. Imagine trying to investigate a burglary and everyone just walks away whenever they feel like it. Imagine investigating a robbery and the possible suspect simply says, "I'm leaving." That's not how investigations work. The officer has a legal responsibility to determine the facts before deciding what happens next. And that takes time. Sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes much longer. It depends on the investigation and other circumstances surrounding it. The investigation begins. Now here's where things become interesting. Many people think investigations stay the same. They don't. Investigations change. Every new piece of information either strengthens the officer's suspicion, weakens it, or completely changes the direction of the investigation. This is where I tell my students that we're about to go down a few rabbit holes, because this is actually how police work happens. One fact leads to another. One discovery leads to another. And before long, the investigation looks completely different than it did when it first started. Chapter 4, Vehicle Stops. Now let's talk about the police contact that most people will experience at least once in their lifetime, a vehicle stop. Whether you've been driving for 30 years or you're 16 years old and just received your driver's license, chances are you'll eventually see those red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. The first thing I want you to understand is this. A vehicle stop is a detention. Once a police officer lawfully stops your vehicle, you are not free to leave. Now let me explain why. Most people believe the officer already knows who they are before they walk up to the car. Officers don't. All they know is that there is a vehicle stopped in front of them. They don't know who's inside. They don't know what kind of day they've had. They don't know if they're a school teacher, a doctor, a mechanic, a mother taking their children home, or someone who just committed a violent crime 2 blocks away. Police officers simply don't know who they're stopping. That's why every vehicle stop begins the same way, with caution. Now think about this from the officer's perspective. If the officer steps out of the patrol car and begins walking towards your vehicle, there are probably a dozen thoughts running through their mind. Can I see the driver's hands? How many people are inside that vehicle? Is anyone making unusual movements? Is someone reaching underneath the seat? Is someone reaching into the glove compartment? Are there any weapons in plain view? Does anyone appear to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs? Is this driver simply nervous, or are they hiding something? The questions aren't being asked because the officer believes that everyone is a criminal. They're being asked because officers are trained to prepare for the unknown. Every officer has heard stories or personally knows officers who never made it home after what started out as a routine traffic stop. That's why officer safety is so important. Now let's switch perspectives. You're the driver. You've just seen the emergency lights behind you. Your heart starts racing. Maybe you've never been stopped before. Maybe you've been stopped several times. Either way, most people become nervous. You begin asking yourself questions. Why am I being stopped? Was I speeding? Did I forget to use my turn signal? Am I getting a ticket? How much is this ticket going to cost? Those feelings are completely normal. Now here's my advice. The safest vehicle stops usually have one thing in common. Both people remain calm. Both people remain professional. If you're the driver, pull over as soon as possible, as soon as safe. Turn off your ignition. If appropriate, keep your hands where the officer can see them. If it's nighttime, consider turning on your interior light so the officer can better see the inside of the vehicle. Wait for instructions though. Wait for instructions. Don't immediately start reaching into the glove compartment. Don't reach under the seat. Don't begin digging through the backpack. Remember, the officer doesn't know what you are reaching for. They simply see movement. And movement can create unnecessary concern. Wait until the officer tells you what they need. Then tell them exactly where you're reaching. And movement they don't understand. They simply see movement. and movement they don't understand can create unnecessary concern. Wait until the officer tells you what they need. For example, officer, my driver's license is in my right front pocket, or my registration is in the glove compartment. Good communication prevents misunderstandings. Now let's talk about another question I receive all the time. Can the officer search my vehicle? If an officer asks for your consent to search a vehicle, you have the right to politely decline. You can simply say, officer, I do not consent to any searches. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't tell you to argue. I didn't tell you to become disrespectful. I didn't tell you to challenge the officer. I simply said, be polite, state your position, then allow the officer to do their job. Depending on the facts of the investigation, the officer may have legal authority to conduct a search without your consent, or they may not. That's a legal determination based on the facts known to the officer at that moment. Now let's answer another common question. Can I just drive away? The answer is no. Remember what we talked about earlier. A vehicle stop is a detention. Once you're lawfully stopped, you are not free to leave until the officer tells you the stop has concluded. If you become impatient and decide to drive away, you've now changed the entire encounter. What may have started as a speeding ticket or a broken taillight can quickly become something much more serious. The officer may reasonably believe you're attempting to flee. Additional officers may respond. The risk of everyone involved increases, so be patient. Let the officer complete the investigation. If you honestly don't know whether the stop has ended, there's nothing wrong with politely asking, officer, am I free to leave? If the officer says yes, then safely merge back into traffic and continue on your way. If the officer says no, then you know the investigation is still in progress. Again, patience matters. One last thing that I'd say about vehicle stops. Parents, please teach your children how to handle a traffic stop before they ever receive a driver's license. Don't wait until they're standing on the side of the road wondering what to do. Practice it. Talk about it. Explain why officers ask them to keep their hands visible. Explain that to them. Let them know. Explain why sudden moves concern officers. Explain the difference between cooperating with lawful instructions and giving up your constitutional rights. Those are two completely different things. You can be respectful, you can protect your rights, and you can help make the encounter safer for everyone involved. That's the goal. Arrest. Now we've reached the fourth and final type of police contact, an arrest. By the time someone is placed under arrest, the investigation has moved beyond simply asking questions. It has moved beyond a detention. At this point, the officer believes there is sufficient legal justification to take that person into custody. Now let me explain something that many people misunderstand. Being arrested does not mean you've been found guilty. It means that the investigation has reached a point where the officer has probable cause to believe a crime has been committed, or the officer is acting on a valid arrest warrant issued by the court. Those are two very different things. The officer doesn't decide guilt. The court does. The officer's responsibility is to make a lawful arrest when the facts support it. The court's responsibility is to determine whether the evidence proves the case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's how our criminal justice system works. Now, once you're under arrest, everything changes. You are in custody. You are no longer free to leave. The officer now has the legal authority to transport you to jail or another appropriate detention facility. Now let me give you a simple example. Suppose an officer stops a vehicle for speeding. The stop begins as a vehicle stop. The officer contacts the driver, obtains the driver's license, runs the driver's information through dispatch. Dispatch comes back and says the driver has confirmed felony arrest warrant. Well, the traffic stop just changed. The officer now has legal authority to arrest that individual based upon the warrant. The officer approaches the vehicle and says, "Sir, at this time you're under arrest. The driver is handcuffed, searched, placed into the patrol vehicle, and transported to jail. That traffic stop became an arrest because new information developed during the investigation. Now let's go back to our apartment complex. Remember the young man wearing the tan shirt and blue pants, blue Nike tennis shoes? Let's suppose that during my investigation, I lawfully discover individually packaged narcotics, a digital scale, several $1,000s in cash, and other evidence commonly associated with narcotic sales. At that point, I've gathered much more information than I had when I first contacted him. If those facts establish probable cause that a crime has been committed, the detention changes. The individual is placed under arrest. Again, the direction didn't happen because of one fact. It happened because the investigation developed enough facts to justify taking that next step. That's how good police work is supposed to happen. One fact leads to another. One observation leads to another. One interview leads to another, until eventually the officer has enough information to make a lawful decision. Now, I want to say something that's very important. If you are ever placed under arrest, remain calm. Do not resist. Do not pull away from the officer. Do not fight, and do not run. If you believe the arrest is unlawful, that argument should be made in court, not on the sidewalk, not in the parking lot, not in the middle of the street. The courtroom is where legal decisions are challenged. The roadside is where everyone is trying to stay safe. Another misconception I hear all the time is, if I'm arrested, I don't have any rights. That is simply untrue. You still have constitutional rights. You still have the right to remain silent. You still have the right to an attorney. You still have the right to have your case heard before a judge. An arrest is not a conviction. It's the beginning of the judicial process. Now, as I bring this lesson to a close, I want you to remember something. Every police contact begins somewhere. Sometimes it's simply a conversation. Sometimes it's a detention. Sometimes it's a vehicle stop, and sometimes it ends in an arrest. But every one of those contacts has rules. Every one of those contacts has legal standards, and every one of those contacts carries responsibilities for both the citizen and the police officer. The more both sides understand those responsibilities, the safer these encounters become. Closing review. There are 4 basic types of police encounters. Number 1, a consensual encounter. A voluntary conversation between a police officer and a citizen, generally speaking, and you are free to leave. Number 2, an investigative detention. An officer has reasonable suspicion to temporarily detain you while investigating possible criminal activity. You are not free to leave until the investigation has been completed or the officer tells you that you are free to go. Number 3, a vehicle stop. A vehicle stop is a temporary detention involving a vehicle. Once your vehicle has been lawfully stopped, you are not free to leave until the officer concludes the stop. Number 4, an arrest. An arrest occurs when an officer has probable cause or is acting on a valid arrest warrant. Once you are under arrest, you are in custody. You are not free to leave. If you remember those 4 contacts, you'll have a much better understanding of what is happening during almost every encounter with law enforcement. Knowledge reduces confusion. Understanding reduces fear. And when fear is reduced, better decisions are made by citizens, by police, and by everyone involved. That is the purpose of law enforcement encounters, learning the badge. My goal isn't to convince you that every police officer is right. My goal isn't to convince police officers that every citizen is wrong. My goal is much simpler than that. My goal is to help both sides understand one another. Because understanding creates communication. Communication creates trust, and trust creates communities. Thank you for joining me for this first lesson of Law Enforcement Encounters, Learning the Badge. I am Samuel Davis Jr. I hope you'll join me next time as we continue learning about the laws, the responsibilities, and the realities of law enforcement. Until then, stay safe, treat people with dignity and respect, please. Continue learning, and always remember, understanding the badge begins with understanding the law. Thank you. See you next time.